Hey everyone, Tactics here, and with 9.1 just recently announced to be coming out on June 29th, I figured it would be a good time to start putting out videos based on how specs are looking coming into the new patch, starting off with the 6 healing specs. I'll be looking there at their strengths and weaknesses and explaining why these are good and bad in both Mythic Plus and rating, as opposed to just telling you that, hey, this spec is the best, play this spec. I'll give you a little bit more of an explanation. I also wanted to make sure everyone is aware, reminding you guys, all 6 of these specs are completely viable in all forms of content, whether you want to be pushing, KSM, plus 20 keys even, AOTC, all the way up to cutting edge. All 6 of these specs are able to achieve that. I'm more going to be talking about what is going to be like the meta and the meta-defining specs. Now, with that disclaimer aside, be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed the video. And let's start off with the elephant in the room, I guess. Holy Paladins. Now, out of all of the healing specs in the game, Holy Paladins have by far seen the most changes going into 9.1, with a bunch of warranted nerfs. Here they are, all targeted at their damage, at their mana efficiency, and then they also changed up the infusion of light procs a little bit to try and get Paladins to use a proc that they were pretty much basically ignoring for the most part. Overall, while there's certainly a lot of words in these changes, they don't really add up to too much in terms of actual a change in the meta for Paladins. They're still going to be the highest passive damage healer by far, even after this about 15% damage nerf, and they bring a ton of important tools to both raids and Mythic Plus. So to give you a better idea on healer damage, here, look at a few different logs. 95th percentile in Mythic here. So single target fight, Hungering Destroyer, Holy Paladins, more than doubling up Disc Priests, you see here. Move to a more AoE fight. Stone Legion Generals, again, more than doubling up the next highest healer damage. Fight like Denathrius, close to doubling up the next highest healer damage. Just overall, Paladins, extremely high damage across the board, and that's going to be something super beneficial that they bring. High passive dam. So that's what they got. That's very, very important in higher end content as well, right? High passive damage from your healers can basically allow you to do things in both high-end rating and high-end Mythic Plus keys that you wouldn't normally be able to do if you didn't have that extra, basically, DPSer, right? So that's very, very helpful in a lot of situations. On top of this, Paladins, I'm sure all of you know, they're basically part of what's like the holy trinity of raid healers right now at the top of the Mythic healing meta. Holy Paladins, Disc Priests, Resto Shamans, right? Those are the 3 healers. And that's basically because those healers all bring, well, 2 of them bring great passive damage, like I mentioned. They all have some sort of DR, with Paladin specifically having that 3% raid DR, just flat. And of course, Aura Mastery being that 15% DR, though again, note this is just a 12% increase in the DR from their passive 3% DR, not a flat 15% increase. So little less value than it seems initially, but it's still a pretty solid cooldown, right? Something like Blood Price from Denathrius. The only real cooldowns that could consistently work on it were Aura Mastery and Rallying Cry. So a lot of value there from having the raid-wide DR and just being able to use that in pretty much any situation there. For looking at other utility, they of course have BOP, an immunity they can put on anybody, which is very strong. They have their own personal bubble, which will work on anything that's not anything instead of just the physical requirement that Blessing of Protection has. And they also have the single target DR in Blessing of Sacrifice, as well as a root removal in Blessing of Freedom. All fantastic utility that is very stackable too, right? So I wouldn't be surprised to see a couple of these healers of Holy Paladins in particular be in the top group, because all of those utilities are solid alone, but they don't lose value when you stack Holy Paladins as well. So that's another great thing for them. Also, if we look at this raid, we saw that Paladins really not struggling at all on mana. They could basically ignore their mana bar for the vast majority of fights. Wasn't too big a deal. And that's another huge strength for them, right? Not needing to rely on mana. When it comes to cooldowns, they of course have the insanely powerful Ashen Hollow. Again, all the top Paladins, they're going to be running Venthyr. Kyrian is probably, I think a lot of people are saying, better overall throughput, but if you're talking about burst throughput, which is a lot more value and lets you put a lot more overall damage, Ashen Hollow is just going to reign supreme, right? Basically letting you carry healing for 30 seconds and then pump out a ton of damage, DPS level damage over its duration. So very, very powerful. In high-end rating, this is, again, invaluable. It lets not only them pump out damage, but during Ashen, a lot of times the other healers can also be pumping out damage just because of how strong Ashen is. And over the course of an encounter, this basically adds up to an entire DPSer, right? So it's possible that you could basically drop a DPSer in high-end rating, bring 2 Holy Paladins to cover the healing and also increase damage, and you're basically covering that lost DPSer while adding another healer to help cover some of the Paladin's weaknesses. The big problem with Paladins, as we saw in this previous Mythic Plus season, was of course dealing with the heavy, sustained, raid-wide damage for longer periods of time outside of their Ashen Hollow. Right? Inside of Ashen, it's not a problem. That of course only lasts for 30 seconds, so outside of that they need to be covered by some of their other healing members on their team. Which we saw with various healing comps, right? 2 Holy Paladins, they would stagger their Ashen Hollows, and outside of that, it would fall onto things like Resto Shamans and Disc Priests to kind of pick up the slack there, and to let Holy Paladins kind of survive until their next Ashen Hollow window, where they could, again, just basically cover everything. In Mythic Plus, we saw them struggle with Prideful, or early on in the expansion at least, and even later on, we saw when they didn't have Ashen up for a Prideful, them making use of specs like Elemental Shaman and Balanced Druids and their insane amount of healing coming from a DPS role to kind of cover for those weaknesses outside of just skipping Pridefuls entirely, which also just happened as well. And all of this was to kind of make up for the Paladin's weakness of, hey, I'm going to have trouble healing any Prideful without Ashen Hollow, but I will bring an insane amount of damage to help do things that you normally couldn't do, right? Bursting Hakar in like 45 seconds. Not possible without a Holy Paladin. Absolutely not possible. Some of those strategies that you use in higher keys, it is absolutely mandatory to have that Paladin burst damage in order to just do things in time. First boss in Mist of Tyrna Scythe. Another perfect example. 1 phasing that boss, or even 2 phasing if on the highest level of keys on like Tyrannical, not possible without a Holy Paladin damage, right? That the Holy Paladin damage is absolutely mandatory for that stuff. If anything, the removal of Prideful going into the next season for Mythic Plus is going to make Paladins even stronger, because that was their main struggling point in Mythic Plus in this first season. If you look at the new Seasonal Affix Tormented, only 1 of the 4 new lieutenants has that pulsing group damage similar to Prideful that they need to worry about, and outside of that, 2 of the other lieutenants actually kind of do a damage type that is more favorable to Paladins, which is damage to 1 to 2 targets mostly at a time, which Paladins, they're great at that. They're great at triage healing, they're great at healing 1 to 2 targets at a time. Fantastic, they can do that all day. So basically, we're moving from a seasonal affix that was fairly hard for Paladins to deal with to a seasonal affix that they shouldn't really have many issues with dealing with. So I would expect Paladins to pick up in 9.1 Mythic Plus exactly where they left off in 9.0 as the top healer for pushing high keys. So recapping, because I was just talking there for a long time and not really typing. So basically, high passive damage, of course. They have DR, CDs. Very strong, both the passive DR and of course their 15% DR, always great to have, especially in high-end rating. Literally just Ashen Hollow. Just that's it. Ashen Hollow, absolutely insane cooldown. Very, very valuable. Lets them do some crazy things. Low mana reliance. Not sure if I touched on that, but basically, mana was a non-issue for Paladins in a lot of cases, in both rating and Mythic Plus, right? Needing mana was really not a thing for Paladins, similar to Shamans, but basically all the other healers, especially Disc Priests, extremely mana hungry. So Paladins being able to do what they do without using much mana at all is very, very valuable. Outside of that, they of course have their great utility, which I mentioned, of course, Bop, Freedom, Sack, all those things. Fantastic utility there. Problems with them, they pretty poor mobility, right? They just have their mount, their steed. Poor mobility. And outside of that, they do struggle a bit in healing sustained damage. Healing, sustained damage. Outside of Ashen specifically outside of Ashen Hollow. During Ashen Hollow, they can do whatever the hell they want. Outside of Ashen Hollow, they have trouble healing heavy sustained damage on the party, which again, we talked about. You either have your other raid healers kind of cover for you outside of those moments, those Ashen moments, or as we saw in Mythic Plus, we either saw them completely try and skip those heavy damage moments, aka the Prides, or you're covered by something like an Elemental Shaman with their off healing, or a Boomkin with their off healing. Now, Holy Paladin done, let's move on to Disc Priest. And I think if there's any healer that has a shot at dethroning Holy Paladins in Mythic Plus, I think it's going to be Disc Priest, specifically Kyrian Disc Priest. Now, I know Kyrian, really not a popular covenant right now for Disc Priest. And obviously when it comes to raiding, it's going to be hard for people to justify switching off of Venthyr because Mind Games is just so strong for raiding. And you're like, why would I switch for this kind of awkward 3-minute CD, which is Boon of the Ascended, the Kyrian power. But thanks to a new Soulbind, Mechanicos is getting a new power, as well as the new Kyrian-specific legendary for priests coming in 9.1. You're actually kind of able to turn into the Fire Mage of healers, reducing Boon's cooldown to about a minute in 4 to 5 target scenarios, and if you're sitting in 1 to 2 target scenarios, you're able to move it down to about a minute and a half. So having or dropping it to a third of the cooldown it previously was, and that's very strong, right? It bumps up their overall damage in dungeons significantly, and when it's combined with the damage increase that Power Infusion brings on a DPSer, Disc Priests are likely to be pretty close, maybe even surpassing Holy Paladins in overall damage in 5-mans. But obviously, the Ashen Hollow difference is that higher burst damage on that longer CD, right? So there's just going to be some pulls, some strategies, and higher keys that basically requires that big Ashen Hollow burst. For example, obviously Hakar has been nerfed going into Season 2, but let's talk about old Hakar. There is no way that Disc Priests, this burst would be enough for that strategy, because Disc Priest bursting on Hakar with this is going to be much smaller than Ashen Hollow Holy Paladin bursting on Hakar, which basically carried with of course, the Boomkin single target burst, the Fire Mage combusting, right? All those things kind of carried that Hakar strategy that we saw, and I don't think that's something Disc could do, right? So if those big singular burst damage moments in a dungeon aren't required, I think Disc Priest could be a solid choice. And they also bring some great utility, right? Mind Soothe, great for a lot of smaller skips. Mind Control, of course, invaluable in certain dungeons. So I can see Disc kind of hot on Holy Paladin's heels, at least for dungeons. For raids, like Paladins, Disc Priests are a staple, right? They're one of the big three, mostly due to their strong kit. They have DRs, they have Absorb Shields, and they combined with high passive damage, right? Another big bonus, high passive damage there. This sets them ahead of a lot of the other competition, right? With Holy Paladin and Disc Priest mostly being the top two in terms of passive damage, at least historically in the past few years, and it's looking to be that way again moving forward into 9.1. They did see one nerf to a dominant talent in Spirit Shell. It's moved from a 1-minute CD to a 90-second CD, which is certainly a hit to Disc because that was their go-to talent for pretty much all of Castle Nathria. Used pretty much every fight, I believe. Right, the big absorb, giving your raid a buffer on any hard-hitting abilities is super helpful. I'm guessing the usage on this talent is now going to heavily rely on what the new fight timers are like, right? 90 seconds, it'll line up with things less, but if there's anything it lines up with, it's likely going to be very strong in that specific fight. But I think what a lot of people forget is this doesn't kill Disc at all because Evangelism is right there. Evangelism is a great talent. It's been overshadowed a bit during this expansion because of the strength of Spirit Shell, but I think Evangelism it's a very strong option for Disc. On top of this, AMZ nerfs, right? Everyone's aware of that. With AMZ being nerfed, I think the relative value of Barrier has gone way up, which is just yet another reason to bring Disc Priest, right? Barrier was already a super strong cooldown, but now with pretty much only Disc Priest and Blood DKs bringing the equivalent kind of DR cooldown there, I think they're in a very good spot, and they've only increased in value in 9.1. Terms of weaknesses, while Discipline is exceptional at dealing with predictable bursts of damage that they are able to pre-plan for, when first learning fights or when in fights that have a bit more of a chaotic damage profile, getting an idea of the timings for a specific boss, this can really struggle. This is due to being Disc being a more proactive healing spec as opposed to a reactive one, and it just takes a little bit of time getting used to. But that being said, while you're getting familiar with a fight, priests can always just swap to Holy, learn those fight timings, and swap back to Disc if need be. So again, to recap for Disc, what do we have? We have high passive damage. We do have DR CDs. They of course also bring the stamina buff, if you guys aren't aware. Mandatory buff likely to be brought by your Disc Priest or Shadow Priest. But that buff is going to be mandatory. It's great to have. They're super great at dealing with healing predictable dam. Alright, anything they can predict, any big hits every minute and a half, right? It lines up with Spirit Shell. They're able to account for that, prepare for that, and heal through that very well. Power Infusion. Great cooldown, both Raids and Mythic Plus. It's not something you're going to see on your meters, but it is something that is quite valuable and something that you can't forget about. They have good dungeon utility. I will note that. It's dungeon utility. Raid utility is not great right outside of their 5% stamina. Life grip sometimes maybe. But really things like Mind Soothe, things like Mind Control, much better in a dungeon environment. In terms of weaknesses, again, mobility, also a problem for them, for mobility. They also just absolutely go through mana. Very mana dependent. Right? Big problem for them. And then dealing with unpredictable damage. Unpredictable damage. Right? So they struggle with that. But again, as I mentioned, when you're first learning a fight, or if there's a ton of unpredictable damage, or you just need pure throughput, they always have the option of going Holy Priest. Holy Priest. They're often looked down upon, right? Holy has had trouble in the past thanks to the constant comparisons it's had with Discipline Priest, because they share the same set of general utility combined with just a lack of DRs, right? Disc has all the DRs, Holy Priest does not. So Holy Priest's normally kind of left playing second fiddle to Disc, and unfortunately that's unlikely to change in Raids or Mythic Plus in 9.1. Now, they did see an interesting change with a redesign of Symbol of Hope, now reducing the cooldown of all defensive abilities for allies within 40 yards by 60 seconds, as well as restoring 18% of missing mana over 5 seconds, all on a 5-minute CD. Now, the theoretical strength of this cooldown is decently high, reducing the defensive CDs of like 20 people in a Mythic Raid, right? That's pretty strong, on top of giving all of your healers a bunch of mana. But there's a couple problems in practice, I think. First, the actual choice of defensive cooldowns is questionable, right? Hit and miss from spec to spec. For example, Hunters, they get Exhilaration reduced. Rogues get Crimson Vial reduced. Death Knights, though, Druids, they get Icebound Fortitude and Barkskin reduced. So those are all very different strength in terms of defensive CD getting reduced. But aside from the selection problem, the other issue is actually getting value from the CDR. Because when you use this ability, right, if you press it, but only 3 to 4 people actually have those defensive abilities on cooldown, you're really not getting a ton of value out of it. And it's a 5-minute cooldown, right? You'd expect to have a ton of value. Think about Ashen Hollow. Ashen Hollow is a 4-minute cooldown. You get so much value from Ashen Hollow on a 4-minute cooldown. But this 5-minute CD is nowhere near the same value. And obviously there's going to be scenarios where this is quite strong. Maybe something like a Sludge Fist type fight where your entire raid's constantly getting hammered, so plenty of people are rotating defensives and you're able to hit a bunch of people with the CDR. But in general, if you're not getting an extra use of the ability, and you're not getting maybe a use specifically for a high danger moment in the fight extra, then it's not really worth the 5-minute CD it has, I think. So it needs something, but I think Blizzard is moving in the right direction with this kind of change, right? You want to give Holy a different niche to kind of make them wanted, and I really like that they're moving in this direction. I just don't think it's quite strong enough for what it is. For Mythic Plus, it's a similar story for Holy, right? Disc brings all the same things, right? Mind Control, Mind Soothe, all those things. No DRs for Holy. and this just has higher passive damage. I will say Holy is certainly better suited to deal with specific affixes like Grievous, which is a point in its favor, at least on Grievous weeks. But hey, Disc Priest, just go Holy for Grievous weeks, right? That's the thing they can do. And another thing for Holy is that they do decent damage when they don't need to heal, right? So when they're actually fully focused on damage, Holy does decently. But again, Disc does a lot of damage passively, and for at least higher end content, usually you're going to have to do a decent amount of healing, and bringing that passive damage is just really, really solid. So for the most part, Holy is just going to remain in the shadow of Disc for both Raids and Mythic Plus in 9.1. As for recapping Holy, again, they have the Power Infusion, they have the Dungeon Utility, same thing as Disc, exact same things there. They have very, very good throughput overall. They of course bring the same stamina buff, all those other things. They're lacking the DR CDs. No DR. No DR. They have poor mobility, just like Disc as well. And of course they have the poor passive damage in comparison to the other healers. Passive. There. Alright. Moving on, we have the red-headed stepchild of healers, Mistweaver Monk. They are actually getting a decent amount of love in this patch with some solid damage buffs. Here, we can go over them. There it is. So a bunch of damage buffs here. Mana reduction to Enveloping Mists, and Revival is now affected by their Mastery, though it did get a 10% flat healing nerf on top of that. Even with this healing reduction, though, Revival did get a decent boost to its throughput as a result of this change, so that's always good to see. Now, in terms of the biggest strengths of Mistweaver, they are completely unreliant on CDs in order to pump out high healing. So they can constantly just put out high healing numbers, though this is at the cost of burning through mana extremely quickly when they want to be at their highest. They also are a bit lacking in terms of their actual CDs available to them in general. Revival, one of the lower throughput healing CDs in the game, and Yulon is also just a bit underwhelming in raid environments. So it basically means what you see is what you get from Mistweavers, right? They're putting out a ton of healing throughput at all times. They don't really go up too much when they use their CDs, but if you have things like Innervates to feed into them, they can pump out an insane amount of healing. Unfortunately, they also lack DRs entirely in their kit, right? No single target, no AoE option. Definitely hurts their stock a bit, especially when compared to the other top healing specs, right? Holy, Disc, and Shaman, Resto Shamans all have some sort of DR. Though a point in their favor is, of course, their high durability. They're very, very tanky, and they're quite mobile as well. I think in general, though, Mistweavers, they're probably going to remain one of the lower representation healers. They already have a small healer population, and there's really not enough changes coming in this patch to kind of push their stock up very much. They're not going to climb very much in the ranks at all. But as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, they will still be more than viable enough for mythic raiding, pushing high keys, but at least on the higher end of raiding, it's going to be kind of hard for them to get a spot over specs like Holy Paladin, over specs like Disc Priest, specs like Resto Shamans. For Mythic Plus, I think they're in a bit of a better spot than they were in 9.1, thanks to a couple things with the seasonal power, seasonal affix, has an anima power that really helps out their mana problems, and there's a few more physical DPS kind of rising in the ranks of the stronger DPS player, or specs rather, which makes Mystic Touch more enticing to have, right? So they're in a decent spot, I think, for Mythic Plus, but again, rating, they're gonna struggle to get spots in high end rating, but they're still solid healer all around. So overall, they of course have on demand throughput, decent sustain, decent passive damage, right? Not as high as something like Disc or Holy, but outside of those two, they are definitely easily the third highest passive damage healer. They also have solid durability plus mobility. Then they have solid dungeon utility again. Things like a Ring of Peace, an AoE stun, Paralyzed, Touch of Death. So good dungeon utility there. In terms of weaknesses, again, as we mentioned, they have fairly weak healing CDs. They're mana dependent. Very mana dependent. And they lack a DR. And that's kind of where they stand in terms of strengths and weaknesses. So, okay. Sorry, I've consolidated the list because I was running out of room because I did not pre-plan this out. It's fine though. We did it. All right. Mistweaver Monks. Here we go. Moving on to Restoration Druids, which again hasn't seen any major changes outside of a nerf to one of their endurance conduits, which really doesn't mean much for them. Currently, they are kind of at the top of the heap when it comes to healing throughput. They're very, very strong throughput, but really there's not too big of a difference in healers when it comes to overall throughput. And we can look at healing logs are terrible, right? But I mean, again, this is a bad metric, but here you go. Right. Resto Druids at the top, not by too much. Just going all bosses too. I think the gap probably shortens a little bit. Yeah. So again, bad metric, but Resto Druids generally consistently at the top, though not by very much, right? Healers are all very, very close when it comes to overall throughput. It's really the type of healing and when and where they're good that matters. But they do technically have the highest throughput, and they're great whether your raid is stacked or spread, so they're very, very flexible when it comes to that kind of thing. Tranquility is also probably the strongest healing throughput CD at the moment, outside of Ashen Hollow, of course, which is just another great tool for Druids to have, right? It beats out Hymn from Holy Priest, of course it beats out Revival from Mistweaver Monks, and it also beats out Healing Tide from Shamans, though of course that they have the ability to also cast while Healing Tide's going off, so that's a different thing entirely. Similar to Mistweavers, Druids are also very, very mobile. They're also very durable. However, they're definitely lacking in the passive damage area, right? Mistweavers, decent passive damage. Obviously, they have to be in melee for it, but still decent. Druids, on the other hand, they don't really have too many spare globals, especially because they kind of have to pre-plan for damage events. They're very similar to Disc Priest in that sense. And so leading up to those major events, they don't really have a lot of free globals to spend on DPSing. So they have to spend all those on things like Rejuve, other hots, as opposed to damage spells. It makes it difficult for them to kind of squeak in that extra damage compared to specs that have similar trade-offs like Holy Priests, who when they're able to DPS can do a bunch of damage and then heal it up after, and Shamans as well. They're able to DPS and then make up for it after because they don't require the same setup time that a Resto Druid does. When it comes to dungeons, the smaller group sizes allows Resto Druid to spend more of these globals on damage, so they have the trade-off isn't as bad there. They're even able to cat weave or chicken weave and use Convoke offensively as opposed to defensively. So that's very good. They bring much more damage, I think, in a dungeon space than they do in a raid space because of that. They also have a ton of utility, dungeon-related utility, of course. Their raid utility, they got Stampeding Roar, and that's about it. Innervate, actually, of course, it's a great utility spell. But again, all those can be brought by Boomkins. And that's the main problem for Resto Druid. All of their utility, dungeon or raid related, is brought by Boomkins, who are still looking decently strong. But again, I'll talk about that in the DPS section, focusing on Resto Druids here. So on Resto Druids, when they're able to full-time DPS, they do decent amount. But even then, they can't get anywhere near the numbers that Holy Paladins are putting out, that Disc Priests are putting out. So it definitely just kind of hurts. Overall, they're just kind of in a bit of a weird spot in the meta, where being able to kind of pump out high damage or high passive damage or just big damage in general is extremely important in both high-end rating and high Mythic Plus. And with healer throughput just being so close, as I showed you before, their slight advantage in that area really doesn't mean too much. And it's likely going to result in them struggling to break back into the meta, at least in Mythic Plus. And of course, they haven't really been super meta in rating for a long time, and that's likely not going to change. So, highest throughput. Okay. That, they have durability and mobility. That, they have dungeon utility. We'll give them that. In terms of weaknesses, of course, passive damage. And while they do have a single target DR, they lack raid-wide DR, which is definitely a hit against them, right? Like, I'm not saying every spec in the game needs to have raid-wide DR. What I'm saying is they need to have something that makes up for this lack of raid-wide DR when multiple other specs have one, right? And currently, I just don't think they do. Right, and that brings us last up to Restoration Shamans, the last of the big 3 healing specs. Again, Holy Paladin, Disc Priest, Resto, Shaman, as I've said throughout this video, when it comes to raiding at least. With literally 0 changes for them moving into 9.1, they're probably going to pick up exactly where they left off, being a mainstay in high-end Mythic raiding, and also a decent option in Mythic Plus. For raiding, well, I do think Spirit Link is often significantly overrated. There's no doubt that situationally, it is absolutely irreplaceable. Right, for example, Stone Legion Generals is a fight where Spirit Link really shines during those healing reductions, combined with damage going out on the raid. So that is exactly the spot where something like Spirit Link shines, or where several people are taking a ton of damage. When there's healing reductions going out, even if there aren't healing reductions going out, if you have like 5 or 6 people in the raid taking significantly more damage than everybody else, if there's like passive damage going out while that's happening, this is a great spot for Spirit Link. And it gets even better if you combine it with something like Darkness, or other scenarios where there's just a ton of passive damage coming out into the raid over 8 to 10 seconds. That's a perfect spot for a Spirit Link Darkness combo, whereas a lone Spirit Link in that situation is really not that great, right? It needs the combo with Darkness in those situations to gain value, but it shines in other values, so it's really a strong cooldown. Not as strong as people give it credit for, but situationally it is absolutely insane. On top of this, something like Ankh Totem. Again, situationally, absolutely huge, right? You can get an extra battle res or 2 over the course of a fight if used correctly. So that's an insane cooldown situationally, and they have those options, right? Having the flexibility to go into to have those kind of cooldowns available to them is very strong. When it comes to overall throughput, Shamans are solid in every situation, and unlike Holy Priests and Resto Druids, their healing throughput CD, right? Healing Tide Totem, you can just drop it on the ground, set it, forget it, keep doing whatever they're doing, whether that being add healing to the situation because they need it, whether that be I drop Healing Tide, there's not too much damage, Healing Tide's going to cover it, I can start DPSing now, or I can move away from things, right? Whereas Holy Priests and Resto Druids, they got a plant when they're channeling their throughput cooldown, right? So if they ever have to move, they ever have to deal with anything, it interrupts their healing throughput, definitely really hurts. When it comes to what they're lacking, like a few other healing specs, they're missing out on passive damage, right? They don't have great passive damage like Holy Paladin, like Disc. Those guys are kind of making up for it, whereas Shamans are kind of making up for the Holy Paladins outside of Ashen, kind of helping deal with those and smooth over those times when Holy Paladins are going to have a little bit of trouble keeping the rate up. That being said, it can hurt a little bit in dungeon content. However, they can get a decent boost to their damage in dungeon content wearing the Earth Elemental Legendary. It makes it pretty decent set in forget a DPS cooldown, right? You just need to press it during big AoE pulls, and you've got an Earthquake down the entire pull, and it puts out respectable damage for sure. Their dungeon utility, also solid. They're the only healer that has an interrupt. They bring Bloodlust. They have an AoE stun. They have a purge. And again, obviously this stuff isn't usually very good in raids. Their interrupt can be. Their interrupt can be super clutch in raid scenarios, right? Things like Denathrius, we saw Resto Shaman interrupt, great. I have a feeling Resto Shaman interrupt also going to be pretty great on a fight like Kel'Thuzad, where you have a decent amount of interrupts going out. In general, just having that interrupt at your disposal in a lot of fights, it doesn't mean anything, but on certain fights, it can be fantastic. So always great to have that in your toolkit. Overall, I just think Shamans, they're going to remain, for sure, one of the raid meta healers, and while they're not going to be a top option in Mythic Plus, they still bring solid tools and are invaluable in the utility that they have, so they're probably going to be somewhere in the middle of the pack for 5-mans. So, what do they have? They have Spirit Link plus Ankh, whether that's regular Ankh or Ankh Totem, both great forms of utility. They also have low mana reliance, similar to Paladins. Right, another healer that's pretty free with their mana, as opposed to something like Disc, as opposed to something like Mistweaver. They have a lot more flexibility when it comes to their mana. Their mobility is decent. They have Ghost Wolf, of course. They're also able to cast while moving on a short cooldown, so that always helps. and they have dungeon utility. When it comes to their negatives, again, passive damage, not great. And single target DR, they are lacking, of course, but they do have a ton of other tools, despite not having that single target DR. So to recap, I think the raid meta is not going to change very much at the top level, likely sticking to a makeup of Holy Paladins, a Disc Priest, and Resto Shamans to kind of, they all fill each other's weaknesses, and they all have access to DRs, to buffs, to utility, and they're in general just a really good combination of healers that can account for each other's weaknesses, which is very, very good to have in Mythic raiding. For dungeons, I think Kyrian Disc is making big waves, though they'll probably have some trouble getting the top spot from Venthyr Holy Paladins. Resto Druids and Holy Priests remain in a bit of a weird spot with high throughput, but poor passive damage and only one single target DR between the two of them, leaving them on the outside looking in for raids, though they both fare much better in Mythic Plus scenarios where they have a little bit more time to let their utility shine. They have a little bit more time to let their damage shine because they're able to kind of fit in more damage as they don't need to heal quite as often as in a raid environment usually. Finally, the Mistweaver buffs, not likely to change too much for them in a raid environment, but like Druids, like Holy Priests, they look much better in 5-man content, especially with some of the anima powers from the new seasonal affix propping up their weaknesses. But that does wrap up my review on how healers are looking in 9.1. As always, I would love to know your thoughts down in the comments below. Let me know what you guys are thinking about healers in the next patch. For those interested, I'll be putting out similar videos for both tanks and DPS specs, so be sure to subscribe and get notified when those videos get posted. You can also check me out on my Twitch at Tactics, where I'll be streaming a ton when 9.1 goes live, from Mythic raiding to pushing high keys, all from a tank POV, so feel free to drop by and hang out. That's it for this video though. As always, thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.